to study tonight a lesson on fidelity. It's a word that we don't use all that much, really, but we do use words that are akin to it. And it's a concept that is extremely important in the kingdom, in the church, but it's also important in our marriages, in our families. It's important in our jobs, our businesses, our professions. This idea of fidelity, I just call it fidelity, a rare jewel. Because in the community, by that I virtually mean the culture in which we find ourselves today, fidelity is something that has been almost lost. That's why when I got to studying this, I got kind of excited about a word because of all that it implies and the things that we can learn about what our responsibilities are whenever we really look at it. It's based entirely on the concept of trust, of loyalty, of dependency, reliability. In fact, I went to Webster, and he had a surprisingly short definition to that word. He just said it's the quality or the state of being faithful. In a word, faithful. But then as it went on, he gave a group of synonyms and a group of antonyms. And if you remember enough of high school English, you remember the antonyms are the words that are spelled differently, pronounced differently, but synonyms mean almost the same thing or explain the word further. The antonyms are the opposite of what the word is. Looking at these synonyms that I found, there is the word attachment, and right with it, then the idea of adhesion, that which is grown together and becomes as one. It's alliance, commitment, compliance, constancy, dedication, devotedness, faithfulness, faith, fastness, loyalty, piety, steadfastness, and troth. When someone in a wedding ceremony might say, "I plight thee my troth," it is saying, I pledge my fidelity to you. I pledge that I will be faithful to you, that I'll be constant, that I'll be reliable, that I'll be devoted, that I'll be loyal, that I'll be steadfast, that I'll be attached and I'll adhere to you. All those things are involved in this concept. The opposite, or antonyms, included some words that really stir up some bad emotions. By that I mean they make us feel ill at ease. Not that they make us mad necessarily, but they just make you feel uncomfortable whenever a word like this comes across, because it conveys so much that is opposite of what's suggested by the concept of fidelity. Disloyalty, infidelity, unfaithfulness, faithlessness, falseness, falsity, inconstancy, and Betty and I talked about this word the other night and never looked at it together. And I admitted to her it's a word I've never seen. Well, I still haven't seen very many times, so I may not pronounce it right. Verdigiousness. I don't think I need words that long very often, but basically the word also means treason. None of those words are encouraging, and none of them would ever cause you to have anything like a warm, fuzzy feeling, would they? Because they're the kinds of words, these that are the antonyms, that would describe somebody who might stab you in the back, that wouldn't be there for you, that wouldn't be dependable, would promise you one thing, but would do something different, or perhaps do nothing. All those are uneasy kinds of feelings when you think of those words. But we're looking at the idea of fidelity. We're looking to the word and the concept of trust. And the word that's like taking a vow, like making a solemn pledge whenever we make a commitment. And this is a spirit that's needed, as I said, in the workplace, in the schools. It's needed in the home, the family. It's needed in the church. If you ever got to a point that everybody in any given congregation practiced absolute fidelity so far as the local congregation is concerned, you'd find people who made every effort in every way, all the time, anytime, every time, to do the things that were necessary to push the church forward, to make it better, to cause it to grow, to stimulate and encourage other people, because they would be totally sold on and into this whole relationship that we call Christianity and church membership as a part of it. I don't know if I've ever seen a congregation that everybody like that. I know I've never seen or been a member of a perfect church, because if I was a member of it, as I've said before, that would keep it from being a perfect church. But we could all strive to renew the basis of our commitment to the Lord and making sure that they are practicing the fidelity that we ought to. I found some passages in the Bible that use this concept, and I want to read to you, I believe it's 5 that I have here. First, in Psalms 139, verse 158, the Lord says, I look at the faithless with disgust, because they do not keep my commands. We were discussing this morning the fact that some people teach that God loves everybody unconditionally, and there's nothing that you could conceivably, possibly ever do that would displease God. But here's a verse that says, I look at the faithless, that is the untrustworthy, the uncommitted, those who are infidelity, likely to practice infidelity instead of loyalty. I look at them with disgust, God said. Same kind of concept as the lukewarm member talked about in Revelation chapter 3, where he says that lukewarmness is nauseating, and God says, I will spew thee out of my mouth. That is, I'll vomit you out. So there are some things that can be true of us, of our behavior, of our character, that are disgusting to God. Not that he doesn't love us, not that he won't forgive us, but he's so disappointed, so displeased that it's disgusting to him when we're that way. Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 14 says, Return, O faithless children, for I am your master. You ought to be keeping my commandments. I'm your master. Come back, come back. In the book of Lamentations, in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 3, is I think the first of the places in prophets that has this phrase, but it says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And it's a book that has the note for being Lamentations. There's the truth that God is good, and that his goodness continues always. But this faithfulness that he's looking for in us is a characteristic that we will always find in him. God, who is faithful, expects us to reciprocate that, to be faithful in return, to reflect it, to mirror it in our relationship with him. In Romans chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, the question is, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness destroy the faithfulness of God? And it does not, and it cannot. Nevertheless, it stands out as being starkly opposed to and different from the spirit and the character that God's looking for in us. When Jesus said, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Let us be people whose word is so trustworthy that we can say again that a man's word is his bond. That if he said it, you can rely on it. You don't have to have a contract and you don't have to have a signature. If he said it, I know that he will do what he said. These are the people that we can rely upon. For this very spirit is the ingredient that's necessary and essential for friendships to exist and abide, for partnerships to be good. You see lots of partnerships, but you don't see nearly enough partnerships where fidelity is practiced. Almost always there's one partner who does all the work and another one who gets all the benefit. I don't know how that works out like that, but partnerships are a tricky business. But they wouldn't be if fidelity was part of the package, if trustworthiness, of faithfulness and commitment were part of the system. It's often, I suppose, just about always pledged, but it has to be there in order for the system to work. That goes over into marriage, friendships, and into companionship and fellowship in the kingdom. Everybody needs to keep his word. Everybody needs to do the right thing. One more verse that's interesting in light of this in Galatians chapter 5, in the giving of the fruit of the Spirit. In verses 22 and 23, Paul said, but the fruit of the Spirit is joy, love, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, and here's that word, faithfulness, and gentleness and self-control. And then he said, against such there is no law. There's nothing wrong with those characteristics in our lives. And whenever we are trustworthy, committed, faithful friends, practicing that fidelity that may indeed be rare, he says there's no law against that. You don't get punished for that. You just get rewarded. God doesn't have any system that says don't go there. But the whole system says that's how you're supposed to be. Whenever he says in the Ten Commandments, you don't lie, don't steal, don't take your neighbor's wife. All that's fidelity in relationship to your neighbor, to your fellow man. You're not taking what's theirs. You're not misleading them. You're not bearing false witness against them, another way to lie. And you're not tearing somebody's heart out because you led their mate to betray them and break their fidelity and their vows to them. When we deal with the vows, it's not a word that we use a lot today, vow. Because the New Testament doesn't have any system that requires that we have a vow system like the Old Testament Mosaical system does. Then we don't talk very much about vows. But what vows really are promises. They are commitments that we promise to someone. And our word ought to be equal to a vow in every circumstance. There are a few places where we do specifically call it a vow, and I'll mention those in just a moment. But some passages that relate to that, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. Now, you're going to see on the board that we've got chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. And that's not Jana's fault, that's mine. I gave her a typo 4 instead of 5, and I didn't catch it until after the PowerPoint was already done. I don't want that to mislead you or to think that it's her fault. That passage says, pay your vows, and it's better in that passage to not make a vow than to make it and not keep it, not pay it. And if you promise something, you're supposed to do it. Psalms 76, verse 11, pay your vows. When you pledge it, when you promise it, you go through with it. Jeremiah 44:25, in the second part of the verse, he said, keep your vows. There's no place that I've ever found in the Scriptures that excuse anybody from any vow. When the Apostle Paul was in his missionary journeys, remember that there's the allusion to the fact that he took a vow and that he even paid the expenses of 4 other men who had also taken a vow, and that was in trying to satisfy the Jews, but still it doesn't take away from the fact that he took a vow. So it wouldn't be wrong. We're not told to, committed to, but if you decide to give a pledge, then it's not a wrong thing. I've seen some people, when elders tried to plan the budget of the church, and they'd ask for people to pledge what they would give in the coming year. And they say the little card that they would sign would say something to the effect that if the Lord wills and things continue as they are, I pledge to give X amount per week. Some people say, I'm not signing that. That's a vow. I'm not taking a vow. I don't know what may happen. I may not be able to do that. Well, that's what the card says, if everything continues the same. But some people just don't want to commit themselves, and they use an excuse. I think. I wasn't in their mind, so I don't know for sure, but it seemed to me that they're just not wanting to make a commitment. Now, when it comes to not making a commitment, boy, that's everywhere. They say, numerically, the demographic studies report that in most of the large metropolitan areas today in the United States, that there are as many and possibly more people who are living together as though they were husband and wife as there are living together who have a marriage license, who have had a wedding and have committed themselves in marriage. That there are about as many people who haven't made a commitment. And still, guys convince women, I think that's the way it usually goes, that I love you and I'll never leave you and I'll stay with you. And I just don't want to sign a piece of paper. If he buys a house, you watch him sign a piece of paper. If he buys a car, you watch him sign a piece of paper. If he wants a driver's license, you watch him sign a piece of paper. He's not really got anything against signing a piece of paper. He don't want to commit to you. And so he doesn't. And that means that pretty soon he can just fly the kite. He can just walk anytime he wants to. And they often do. How they sell that, I don't know. But they continue to. That violates the whole concept that originated with God. Jesus, when he was asked in Matthew 19 about divorce, and they asked him, is it legal, is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? He said, don't you remember that in the beginning God made them male and female? That's a different sermon, isn't it? He made them male and female. And then he told them they were to come together, that they were to commit to each other, essentially. When he said a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, they two become one flesh. They're one now. They're united. They have that adhesion that the word fidelity it has as a synonym. They are in adhesion. They're stuck together. And he said, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. He's saying, from the beginning, it wasn't that way. People say, well, things have changed a lot. I will say they have. And continue to change. But where fidelity is a factor, It's because of the vows that we take whenever we go through a wedding ceremony. But so many people say, well, that's okay as long as it works for me. But then I want a way out, and they take a way out. Which brings us to the question of marriage vows. When did wedding ceremonies begin? And when did the ceremony that we typically speak of as a Christian marriage ceremony, when did that start? And when did these vows that nearly every preacher cites whenever he does a ceremony, probably yours? They're getting real scarce now on love, honor, and obey. You notice that? But the pledges are made that I'll stay with you for better or worse, good and bad, sickness and health, whatever, until death do us part. I don't know where those vows came from so far as a quotation of them is concerned, because there is no wedding ceremony in the Bible. If I do a wedding, I can't turn to a book, chapter, and verse here and find what a wedding is supposed to be like or what vows are supposed to be exchanged. I can tell easily that it's supposed to involve commitment, but I can't tell you exactly what's supposed to be said. I can tell you what they mean. When somebody takes a vow that I pledge my troth to thee as I pledge you my faithfulness. And whenever I say that I'll be with you through good and bad, it means that. It means if you get sick, whenever I say through sickness and health, it means I'll stay with you and I'll help you through the sickness if I can. It does not get down to the specifics of if you gain some weight, I'll still stay there, but it includes it and commitment. If you get wrinkles and old, you're not as pretty as you are now when we're getting married at 21. There's no out on those things. I knew a deacon one time who divorced his wife because she had acquired a mental illness. He said, she's not the same woman I married. She's mentally ill. So my vows were to a sane woman who had no mental illness. And so I'm free. And I thought, you scoundrel. When she needs you most, you're taking a ship. Well, who do we think we are that we could just set aside these promises we make? And often in those pledging situations, words are said to the effect that this is before God and our family and our friends, that we're making this promise. It's public. It's a commitment that's made in public and largely signed to as well. And yet, people don't think that it binds that much. The vows, until death do us part, really means that when everybody else leaves, when everybody else turns their back on you, everybody denies you, as everybody else disowns you, you look around and you see no one. Look again. I'll still be there. That's what that means. And those are what pledges ought to be, the degree of commitment that they ought to have. And what happens when these vows aren't kept? What happens when vows are broken? The short story I'd like to say is, look at King David. And if you had King David in a 3-act play, in Act 1, there he is on the rooftop, and he's looking down and seeing the woman that's attractive and being indiscreet. He's tempted, and he calls her to himself, and adultery is committed. Act 2. He calls her husband to himself because he's learned that she is with child. He wants to try to hide the facts. Bring him home from the battlefield. He'll sleep with his wife, then he'll think that's his child. Easily solved, he thought. But Uriah was a better man than he thought he was. And he said, I won't go home and enjoy the pleasures of my wife when my fellow men are out there in the battlefield. And it messed up David's plan. Act 3 is a mourning stage. Because by now, not only has he committed adultery, he's also been responsible for the death of Uriah. And Act 3, he's in mourning. He had to admit to the prophet, I sinned. He wept for days in sackcloth and ashes when the child was sick. He mourned for what had happened. The Psalms 51, he said, my sin is ever before me. Chapter 32, he said, as long as I was still in my sin, I was miserable all the time. That's what happens when the vows are broken. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's not a pretty picture, but it's repeated often. How do we avoid the breaking of those vows? Probably the rest of what I've got here ought to, for audible reasons, be held for another time. But let me just iterate very briefly this list. If you want to keep your marriage together, communicate, stay in touch, talk to each other, understand each other, grow together. Don't grow different directions. Don't have separate interests that take you in different directions with different people all the time, but do things that bring you together. Keep your courtship going. The same thing that caused your mate to think you were attractive and a good person to marry will also keep them thinking you're a good person and attractive to be faithful and loyal to. We call that courtship. Keep on growing. Love gets deeper and deeper and better with age. You may think when you get married, I couldn't love her anymore. You can't. And you stay with her and be faithful, and you will. She'll love you more, better too. It's good. That's the way God intended it to be for us all. Keep on forgiving and keep on forgetting, because there'll be some things that need to be forgiven. There'll be some things that need to be forgotten. If you keep on forgiving and keep on forgetting it, then you hold it together. And the vows are kept, the marriage lasts, and it will work in any kind of relationship if we do that together. But I'm going to close. If you're subject to the invitation of the Lord in any way tonight, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.